Welcome to the Vantage Doers web series. This web series is brought to you by Vantage Circle. In this web series, we bring you practical lessons from the trenches, the how-to guides. We will discuss the best tactics that can help you rethink your employee engagement strategy with actionable approaches and solutions.
Very warm welcome to everyone. I'm Partha, Neog, the CEO and founder of Vantage Circle. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone to the Vantage Doers webinar series. A couple of lines about us. We are a 10-year-old company. We are in the space of employee engagement. We provide a platform through which to run different employee engagement activities like rewards and recognition, employee wellness, pulse surveys globally. This Doers series of webinars, which we have been conceptualized with the idea of sharing practical knowledge with HR practitioners. Now, I'd like to stress upon the practical knowledge. We're not talking about a 30,000 feet overview, but this is more to take care of the immediate aspects of implementation based on challenges which we see in the HR world. This webinar is one such effort to answer those important questions which have been on our minds because of the situation in the last 1.5 years or so. Today we have invited Alec Bashinsky, who's currently the APAC partner for Bersin Academy. Bersin Academy, as most of you would already know, is one of the world's first professional development academy for human resources. And I'm really excited about today's topic, which is HR preparing for what life would be like post COVID-19. I'm sure all of you have read a lot of articles, seen a lot of webinars, heard a lot of podcasts around this topic. But who better than Alec to tie it all together, to give us a framework to think about it, So before I hand it over to Alec, I just run a quick poll and then we can get started on this. Okay. So I'm just putting the poll up for it. We'll just take half a minute on this and then over to Alec on this. All right. I'm just launching the poll. Here's the poll. All right. And just for information, as you are filling up this poll, it will be about half an hour of the session, of the presentation, and then we'll have the Q&A. But in the meantime, to keep your questions coming in, we will be curating those questions and trying to answer those after the end of the presentation. All right, so I'm ending the poll now. Over to you, Alec.
Thank you very much, Partha, and thank you for the kind introduction. So this afternoon, I'm going to try and give you firstly some outlines of some of the research that we have done as Bersin Academy. In particular, we've gone through and looked at and spoken to about 350 CHROs that work globally, and they represent about 180 plus global organisations. And there's a lot of conversation going on at the moment around the whole context of the pandemic. And in particular, a lot of organisations are still talking about, wait till things get back to normal. And our very strong view here, which is backed up by the research, is that we won't be going back to what we used to be or the way we used to operate. In fact, we all have to prepare for what we call the new normal in terms of the working environment. And the key component of that new normal is actually transforming businesses and actually transforming HR. And this is something that, you're not going to spend 12 months transforming. Organisations are moving so quickly now that the onus is on you and your business to move quickly. So if we look at the left-hand side of that slide, you can see that as the pandemic approached, we started to see, a huge uptake in everything from masks to safety and health products. all of our shopping started to go online, and the online amounts were just extraordinary, and less face-to-face shopping. We started to see many platforms become very low-touch customer service. And in particular, we started to see the rise of both digital entertainment and digital healthcare. I mean, let's face it, I'm here in Sydney at the moment, and we're into week 3 of lockdown, which I can assure you, if you've been through it, is not fun. But again, you can start to see everything move towards digital transformation. And with that came also the impact of a talent shortage. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Now what we're seeing is the new norm is very much either working remotely and working from home. And there's a distinction between both of those, which I'll explain in a moment. We're starting to see more and more inquiries from organisations about how do they create agile teams. There's a huge uptake in digital.
Can I just pause you for a minute? I think you're in the slide mode. You have to be in the presentation mode. I think I see your next slides also coming up.
Okay, bear with me. So I'm hopeful. I'm not sure why that's happening there, to be honest with you. Let's just have a look. I'll try that. Is that better?
Let's see. Yep, working. Yep.
Okay, so let me move to, oops, sorry, we'll come back. So what we're seeing is a huge uptake in the digitisation of businesses, and in particular HR. We're seeing lots of organisations starting to move to enhanced communications, systems like Slack, etc. We're still seeing a lot of conversations around equity in hiring, and we're hearing a lot more around both the skills and capability development. So we've started to drift away from the business and the economy, and it's now very much about the people and the work. And with that comes a whole lot of change. And what we're seeing here is that we already have a labour shortage. A lot of people during COVID took the opportunity to retire. The birth rates have been low, although I'm sure they will uptick. And we're seeing a lot of people have dropped out of the labour market. So the statistics that we're seeing in our research from America, and certainly Australia, is that our talent vacancies have already exceeded the numbers that were there pre-COVID, which is a frightening thought if you're trying to attract talent at the moment. We're also seeing lots of people doing what we call side hustles, so contract workers that maybe run 2 jobs. We're seeing a lot of focus around the employee experience and retention. We've even seen some CEOs that have turned around and said, well, I don't believe in this remote working and I want my employees back at work. And unfortunately, those employees are coming back and feeling less than safe and are moving on to other organisations. So the retention piece is important. We're seeing a lot of internal mobility, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And we're seeing a lot of work being done around leadership. And if you think about this, if I'm a leader and I have a team of 10 people, I used to get together with them in an office. Now I have to do it via Zoom or WebEx or Microsoft Teams or whatever. And invariably, people are having so many different meetings that they're getting to the stage where they don't know whether they've actually connected with their employees. In fact, the Microsoft Work Trends Index has said that since the COVID pandemic started, meeting time has more than doubled. Remote chats are 50% up, and our email traffic has just exploded because there's no other way of communicating. So as HR, we need to be aware of these sorts of changes. So perhaps now is a good time to just run a quick poll, and I'd be really interested that, has your business model of operations changed since COVID began, or are you still operating the same way we used to? So I'll just throw that open as a poll. We'll give you a couple of minutes for this. just while I'm waiting for this, we are seeing a lot of change with the operational models. We're seeing a lot of change with decision-making processes. As an example, a global pharmaceutical company used to have 6 steps coming from a regional decision maker to a committee up to the central model. They had to get rid of 4 steps out of that process because the decisions were taking too long, and in COVID times, they needed to be made very, very quickly. Okay, how are we doing here? Okay, all right, let's move on. Make sure I'm back here. Okay, so one of the large pieces of research that Josh and we as a team did is to start to look at new operating models, and global organisations are moving so quickly now to revamp their operating model. So if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, before COVID, it was all about efficiency and being responsive, but the key element of this operating model was central control. So it's everything coming out of head office or everything coming out of the home office, and it was distributed globally for execution. It was very much around looking at analytics. It was self-directed learning and a very strong focus on business priorities. So if you look at the very bottom, the way organisations used to measure their success was basically around efficiencies and then their traditional employee satisfaction or pulse surveys. What we've seen quite dramatically has been a shift to what we call an adaptive operating model. So what we're seeing now is distributed control, but with centralised coordination. So if my head office is in America, but I'm running Asia Pacific, I have the ability to now to make decisions affecting Asia Pacific rather than going back and seeking permission or seeking approval to do that coming out of the US central office. So we're seeing a lot of that change. We're seeing a lot of cross-functional teams being developed and looking at design thinking to start to solve new problems that perhaps are an outcome of COVID. We're seeing, as I mentioned before, agile pools of people. Josh, myself, and 2 others are getting so many requests from organisations to help them develop an agile organisation. So agile's the flavour of the month at the moment. And the real value coming out of what we're seeing from a HR professional and indeed organisational point of view is the rise of the development of skills and capabilities. You notice I said skills and capabilities and not competencies. And there's a real change in that as well. So the success here is all about speed and quality of response as distinct from efficiency and employee satisfaction, a big change in operating models. So maybe again, and this is probably the one more of these to go, but a poll from you. We'd love to know what type of workplace model does your company currently operate under? So if you just have a think about what I've said about the traditional hierarchical approach versus the more agile, adaptive way, we'd love to know how you operate at the moment. And again, with Josh Bersin, we've done our own research in this space, and it's interesting that there's so many different versions of a hybrid model, and I'm about to talk about that in a moment. So it'll be really interesting to see what your company is working under. Okay, another minute. Okay, so the new future of work is being spoken about everywhere, and I think Partha, you referred to it earlier. Every organisation, every consultant, every person around the place is talking about the new future of work, and many people have their own view around this. So you need to be mindful when you're reading about the new future of work. You always need to check the research. and check the depth of that research, because it's easy for someone to stand up there and say, I believe this will change. We're very much around building this from research. So Josh has recently released what we call a big reset report, and this is specifically around hybrid working model. Now, before I quickly go through those 6 points, let me give you a little bit of feedback on the questions that we just asked you. So we haven't come across any global organisation in Europe, in Asia or in America that's actually forcing their employees to go back to the workplace 100%. I read an article from Goldman Sachs' CEO saying that by the end of June, he wanted every employee back in the office. And I'm not sure how that's going to work. That's the only organisation that's actually made that statement. We are seeing the majority of organisations ask their employees, how do they want to work? They're very happy for them to work 5 days a week remotely, or they're setting up their office framework so that they could do 3 days from home and 2 days in the office. So we're seeing that type of thing work out. As to the research here, organisations in our view need to be really clear around defining what you mean by hybrid work strategy. You need to make sure, how does it fit into your vision, your culture and your strategy? Because there's no point having a strategy that says we're going to do this, this and this, and we're going to collaborate in teams in the office when in fact that's not what you're going to do. You also, strangely enough, need to have a measurement system. So you need to be clear around what you're wanting to measure here. Is it performance? Is it well-being? Is it employee safety? Is it what do you want to measure here? Is turnover a measure of your hybrid system? So you need to make sure that you have defined a measurement system so that if you get asked questions around the success of your model, which you will, you're able to clearly articulate the measures and what you're measuring on. The third component for us in the hybrid work model is based around operating with cross-functional teams. HR traditionally has been an interesting organisation in that they've always identified the problem, tried to resolve it as a HR function, resolved the solution and perhaps brought in some technology and then gone to the business and told them what they need to do. Over the last 18 months to 2 years, that has completely swung the other way. And every solution now, even if it's a HR solution, is being co-created and collaborated on between HR and the business. And this is part of the way agile teams work. So you need to be really clear around how you're resolving organisational issues, even more so relevant in a remote environment, and cross-collaborate. And that leads to the next point. You have to involve employees in the design, because in a lot of cases, if you're designing for a solution, the remote nature or the communication style or your inability to listen to multiple ideas, because we happen to be doing it through Zoom or through Teams or whatever, you can actually miss some of the real gems of resolving some of these issues. So co-design with your employees. The fifth one is perhaps one that people don't think about, and that is you need to consider the entire employee experience. So hybrid is all about, it's not all just about remote working. It's about how do we effectively work as a team and co-create solutions. It's about how do our process become more simplified. It's about how effectively do our leaders lead in a remote environment. And there's a range of other things. The other thing you've really got to consider is that your hybrid work model or strategy is actually going to become your employee brand. So you've got to think about going to market, and what I mentioned earlier is a tough marketplace, and actually be able to talk about what your hybrid model is, because if you communicate that effectively, employees will see that as a very strong brand to come to your organisation. And I think a lot of organisations are forgetting about that. And then the final component is really just to make sure that, as I mentioned before, and Partha and I were just talking, that a lot of people see this whole transformation process, this whole transformation journey as a project that is a start and a finish date. But this is iterative. It's got to be an ongoing process. You can't say by September we've finished it all and it's done, because things are changing. So it's got to be iterative, and it's got to be continuous improvement. There's a huge report around that. If anyone's interested in information, I'm happy to provide you with the links there, but there's a lot to that. So I'm going to move on and talk about what has happened in terms of the COVID change model here. And I think this is where, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of change. And I'm just going to try and get out of my screen here. But what we're seeing at the moment is that if you go back to 2019, the management philosophy was very much around, a purpose. It was based around sustainability. It was about empowering the team. And, in those days, it was all about the teams, and the team leaders were the kings. And you can see organisational examples of Netflix, Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc. What has happened during COVID is that we've moved away from that. We've introduced wellbeing into that process. We've introduced a keyword called trust. In a global scenario where governments continue to be one of the least trusted, your community environment perhaps isn't the high element of trust. Research from, I'm trying to remember, Edelman actually has shown us that employees trust their organisations a lot more. So if you break your trust as an employer, your employees will actually disengage and leave. So that trust element has come to the fore. And it's now about the individual, the community, and the family. Let me give you an example of why family is sitting in there. During the COVID lockdown, a well-known pharmaceutical organisation called Novartis, who is one of our clients and a member of JBA, they decided to re-release all of their online learning back to their employees because they were sitting at home, they had time, they wanted to develop. But what they also did is open that learning up to the employee's family. So you had then, partners, and you had some of your kids actually participating in that. The uptake for Novartis was something like 30% re-enrollment in those online courses. So we're seeing, from a safety point of view, from a wellbeing point of view, and from a learning point of view, that the family has become part of the organisation and the community because of the safety element. So a lot of change there. And we've moved from what we would say a very strong business-centred focus. In other words, the CEO and the exec team have just got to lead the business, drive the strategy, and bring the people on to sort of execute. So it's a bit of a business first, people second, or the people execute the strategy. Now what we're seeing is a total focus on the employees. So it's about, how do I lead the people and allow my employees to drive the business, to feel like they're part of it, to feel like there's a connection point. So, people become the purpose of the business. In fact, we had one of our global CHROs said to us in our research that he instructed the CEO to become the chief empathy officer and communicate regularly with employees about what was happening in the COVID environment and what impacts it was having on their organisation. So the chief empathy officer is a new role for many CEOs. And this is probably one of the biggest areas, and I've included this as an example of change. We're seeing many organisations, including those on the left, have adopted or implemented new digital technology so that their internal employees can see opportunities within the organisation, rather than going, I'm leaving tomorrow to join company X. And then when we look at it, we had the same sort of role within our own organisation. And the leader goes, well, why did they leave? We had it here, but there's no transparency about internal opportunities. So there's companies like Gloat who now create the internal talent marketplace. They look at your interests and skills, they match them to the database, and you can come in one morning and you can see that in the middle there's a new position available which might suit your skills. Or alternatively, on the left-hand side, there's a project that's become available in your organisation that you might want to participate in. Or there's someone looking for a mentorship. So the quick slide that you see here is actually what is happening in terms of internal mobility. So if you haven't considered that now as part of the new hybrid working model, something that's it's quickly becoming a way of retaining and building employee experience. So talking about employee experience, if you look at some of the issues about going back to work, I don't want to get caught up in workstation design or office layout, but what's our contact tracing strategy? What about vaccines? What about fatigue? What are we doing about travel? Do we have to attend? How do we schedule this stuff? So there's so many different things that impact the employee work experience that, as I said earlier, when you're building the hybrid working environment, you've got to consider all these things, because even though there's a safety component to having an office layout, what does that do to the engagement of the employee if there's one person in one corner of the office and one person in another corner of the office? So we're seeing a lot of different things currently and post-COVID that will impact your experience. And Josh talks a lot now about the irresistible organisation. So if you're an irresistible organisation or an attractive organisation to your internal talent and your external talent, you will have everything and be really good at meaningful work, which is still the key reason why people stay. Your management will be involved and hands-on. You'll create a positive environment. You'll be very conscious of health and well-being of your people. You will provide opportunities for growth and learning, and you'll continue to invest in your people and the society in terms of that empathy component. So again, we're seeing it's difficult to achieve all of those boxes, but as long as you know what that looks like, you can actually move on that journey. So we're seeing a lot of companies trying to move to that type of organisational experience. So with that in mind, this might be an opportunity to do our last poll, and that is, in the near future of work, what other things or additional things would you like to add to your current organisation? It could be anything that you want to go down that path, but perhaps let's have a look at our poll questions. I'll be really interested in the outcome of this, because when we do our research, we ask our global CHROs many of these questions. So it'd be quite interesting to get your viewpoints on this. We'll give it another minute just to allow you to complete that. And it's interesting, during COVID, many people saw wellbeing, and I'll talk about this in a moment. Many people saw wellbeing and the things that went with wellbeing, like free food and bring your dogs to work and all of that sort of stuff. They've all disappeared off the radar, and we're now starting to see more meaningful approaches to wellbeing in general. Okay, how are we doing? Okay. All right, so the last few slides, and as I mentioned, wellbeing has really moved from being a benefit issue. If you look at the bottom left-hand side, you can see medical benefits, employee assistance schemes. We went through the next phase. Everyone got confused between wellbeing and fitness. We all had fitness apps, we all had gym memberships and everything else. We then started to move wellbeing into things such as mental health, mindfulness, cultural fit. The family came into play. And now we're up to the sustainable context. In other words, the work environment, skills, leadership, opportunities, etc. And our research very strongly now sees wellbeing actually sitting in the laps of the boardroom, not just the exec team, but the boardroom. Whereas if you had gone back 5 years, it was all about what I would call those esoteric benefits that added to a package. And COVID has really forced that issue. I think as COVID moves away or is managed in a better way, we're going to see still wellbeing as a key component of an organisation's strategy. So into the last couple of slides, and there's always well, what does that mean for HR if we're trying to build the workforce model of the future? We're trying to understand how to work effectively in a hybrid working model. What does that do for HR? And if you haven't already seen that, which I think you should have, but HR's had to reinvent itself in so many different ways. We've had to become the leader of what we do to ourselves is what we do for the organisation. So we're already seeing, and I mentioned it before on the left-hand side there, that we're seeing so much work being done now on agile organisational models. We're starting to see reskilling, and lots of people say, well, this part of my business is gone. These people don't know digital very well, so I'm going to move that workforce out and I'm going to hire a whole new skilled workforce. The bad news is that there isn't a whole new skilled workforce out there. And if you happen to work in cyber or any of the other interesting technology areas, you're in high demand. So what we talk to organisations about is understanding their employees and how to effectively reskill them. Many of the HR practices that we had are now being reinvented, and they're being specifically driven by digitisation of the HR function. We're seeing artificial intelligence start to play a bigger picture around understanding organisational fit, around how to cope with siloed mentality. The other component on the right there, you can't just go out and copy a global leader that's doing agile really well or doing something. You have to understand the concepts, and then you have to work to invent, iterate, and build your own components. And as I said earlier, the key component now we're seeing is that if you're not around analytics, if you're not around technology and digitizing HR, getting rid of transactional elements of HR and starting to use proactive digital technology in HR, then you're being very much left behind. One of the other things that we're seeing is that we're getting away from specialized HR people, i.e. specialised REM, specialised employee relations, etc. And we're seeing now a broadening of the skill set. So there's an opportunity now for HR to become broader HR professionals, and I'll show you what I mean by that. In the IT industry, you have a concept called the full stack IT engineer. In other words, they know everything from the basic component to the strategic component and how to do it and what tools to use. Many organisations are still sitting in the blue and green boxes for their HR people. They do consulting and problem solving. They do the basic HR disciplines. But we're starting to see organisations move to far more business acumen. And then if you really want to be a HR professional of the future, you need to understand everything from analytics and AI, as I mentioned, and technology. But you also need to understand how to influence leaders. You need to understand around organisational leadership. So for HR, it's more about how do I broaden my skill set, not fine-tune my skill set. And that's where it's heading to. And the final slide before we pass over a bit of Q&A is that one of the reasons, as Partha mentioned at the front end, that Josh decided to form the Academy is that there's been no specific HR development programs anywhere globally. You can go in and you can participate in a workshop for one element. You can go in and maybe do a bit of research. So Josh has set up the component. There's close to 100,000 members at the moment across about 150 companies. We cover about 25 online programs that take 5 to 6 weeks to complete. There's a huge community and resource centre, and there's a huge networking component in it. So if we say to people it's a hybrid working model, if we say you're a full stack HR engineer, you actually need to build skills within your own HR teams to be able to move with the future of work. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and we might, Partha, I think, jump into a bit of Q&A.
Great, Alec, thanks. I think a couple of very interesting insights. You can stop sharing the screen, I guess.
Yeah.
So as we get the Q&A coming in, please send across your questions. We'll be happy to answer them now. And just for information, we will be sharing this presentation, and the recording will be available for you to view it. Just the last slide about the full stack HR. I mean, are we expecting too much? A full stack HR. There's a lot of things there, right?
Yeah, but I think what happens is we see the HR, I'll call them the HR business partners that support the business. they only have the opportunity to work and help their business leaders with the knowledge they have. So if it's a different question around performance or organisational development or learning management systems or analytics, invariably today's HRBP doesn't have that skill set. So they then got to go back to whoever the centres of excellence is and bring that information on board. What we're seeing is HR organisations are changing. Their centres of excellence are becoming a lot thinner, and the capability set across the HRBPs is becoming a lot broader. You can't achieve that overnight. And I keep hearing, even in today's world, I've heard it in my career for at least the last 20 years, oh, I can't get a seat at the table, or I want a seat at the leadership table, or something like that. If you don't have the broader skill sets, you can't contribute meaningfully in that sort of environment. So the challenge is to see HROs to develop their HR teams and to broaden out their skill sets.
Makes sense. So one interesting question. So from Hemant is asking, how do you manage empathy in this digital world? I mean, even in the physical world, it has been always difficult. Now in the digital world, how do you do that?
Look, I think it's the ability to do two things. One is the organisation needs to train its leaders. I use the word empathy, but it needs to train its leaders in additional leadership skills, such as their ability to ask far broader questions about the individual, rather than, if I'm talking to you about work, I'm talking to you about, okay, so where are you at in this project? What have we done here? Will you deliver on your outcomes? Where are you at with this? Where's your budget? And how are you tracking to it? We need to stop that component and start to build the leadership capabilities out to ask questions such as, well, how are you doing? How are you finding the communications? What's working well for you? How can I as a leader help you? And you've got to build that I'll use the word empathy skills, but they're really those power or soft skills, as Josh talks about, so that you're asking broader questions in this environment. The second component is, and it's a really hard one for many leaders to do, and that is be quiet and listen to what your employees are saying. Because if you're not interpreting the messages, or if you're not listening, then as a leader, you're also failing. So the two elements of skill sets are start to ask more questions about your employees and start to listen more effectively than just your old style if you're in a room with them as such. So that'd be my two quick comments.
True. Very true about that. One of the polling answers, which we, the highest ranking third question which we had, flexible working hours seems to be the biggest demand there. Okay. Now, I'll just add a different twist to that. Now, flexible working hours also sometimes means no start and no end. Okay. So which I personally feel a lot of problems. Okay, I know this person, it's a lockdown, right? So people are there at home. So can I just call that person up? Anyway, they're not going on holidays now. So the flexibility has to be there, but the start and end also has to be there.
I think, and this is one of the issues that a leader needs to be aware of. So if a leader's doing, let's be conservative. Let's say they're doing 7 to 8 Zoom meetings a day. And I have many of my clients that try and talk to us along the journey, but they're back to back. Sitting down doing 7 or 8 Zoom meetings is a pretty hard and mentally straining piece of work. So you have to be careful as a leader that if you want an answer to something, that you're not expecting your employee to respond at 7 a.m. to a Zoom meeting or at 7 p.m. to a Zoom meeting. You need to create what would I call it, that flexible work environment whereby when you can contact the employee and the employee knows when they can communicate with you. Because flexible means exactly that. I can finish all my emails between 7:30 and 8 and then disappear for a run for an hour. I'm working flexibly. I've completed what I need to do, but at the same time, I'm not available from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And I think that's a real challenge for both leaders and for employees to actually know when to turn off.
True. So one might be that someone asked that you had a full stack HR, that you talked about 6
Yep.
5 families of skills. What are the 6 diamonds? I mean, I didn't get this actually. Maybe you.
Yeah, look, I think, was it about the 5 families and skills and dimensions to mastery? Yeah. So what we talk about here, and we actually, for organisations, we've developed a capability assessment diagnostic. And what it does, the families are based from everything from HR tech to business acumen to performance, etc. But what we do, we've developed capability descriptors underneath each of those. And the diagnostic is something that an employee or an HR organisation sends out to its employees. There's about 60 questions and sub-questions. And the way we rate the individuals is from novice to master. And in the capabilities, let me give you an example here. So if I've just come across employee relations or industrial relations and I've never dealt with a union or I've never dealt with any agreements, then I would be a novice. If I've, however, completed enterprise bargaining agreements, I actually am a public speaker in this domain, then I would rate myself as mastery. So we ask people not how good they are at these capabilities. We ask what they have done in that space. So they've got to be able to demonstrate that. What we then do is produce a strengths and gaps analysis for the organisation based on each of the families. And we do it for the individual as well. That way, a HR function knows where they can go and invest their resources to develop their HR people.
Right, makes sense. So something from my, I have been thinking on, I don't think you have picked it up in today's presentation, but maybe you can just help. So one is about hiring and the salaries, remote working. Okay, how do you manage that? Now the kind of work done is same, whether you're in San Francisco or in Delhi, the kind of work is same. Now, how should I care about where the employee stays? How do I give the salaries? How do I fix up? I'm sorry, this is not exactly what you've talked about today, but
we get asked this a fair bit. What we're seeing, the areas that remuneration is moving most quickly in is in those scarce or new job roles or new areas. Cyber is almost yesterday's news. It's been around for forever, but we're seeing all sorts of different technology-related roles appearing for which the demand is high, the pool of talent is very small, and the individual can play themselves out in the open marketplace. The remuneration is always a difficult one here, and I think many of the global companies like Mercer and Hay and a few of the others are still operating on the old remuneration model. So there needs to be broader incentives. We're seeing organisations that are committing to additional incentives apart from remuneration. So they're investing and making time available for employees to learn, to develop their skills, and that's built into their contract. The remuneration piece, I think, is going to be difficult wherever you are. It's going to be a little bit of supply and demand. And unfortunately, in the current environment, we're still left with existing salary surveys, which I must admit, I don't put a lot of faith in. And specifically, if you've got a brand new role, as I referred to before, there isn't the data available in that technology area. So maybe here's a great opportunity for a comp and benefits organisation to start up some meaningful remuneration data in those highly skilled scenarios. So yeah, it's a hard one to answer, but we're seeing more people stay with the base salary but provide additional incentives, particularly in the learning space.
Okay. So there's an interesting question. How do you recommend to tackle a situation where the decision-making leaders don't understand the employee's fear of safety to travel to office? Basically, the leader says, Goldman Sachs is an example, right? So you come to office. Now, what do we do about that?
Look, I think one of the things that you need to do is you need to pull out some data from other organisations to provide an example to your leaders. Number one, as to what they're doing and the impact on employee engagement and retention. And the second thing that you need to do is to start to talk about employee turnover or employee concerns about the office and what that will do to your engagement, to your morale, and indeed to your retention. So you've got to use some retention analytics, but you've also got to provide other examples and then provide business reasons around what they would need to do in order to consider employee safety. Because as I mentioned, and everyone saw it in the slides I put there, wellbeing is well and truly on the map. And the danger is, and I'm reiterating what I said earlier, the danger is that an organisation doesn't pay enough attention to communicating or ensuring there's a safe work environment. Then employees will do that for a few months or for a short period of time. But if they find another job that's as interesting, that they don't have to travel or they can work from home, then they will leave your organisation and go to that one. And that's where I was talking about the employee brand. So it is a challenge, but you've got to put information, data and reasoning up to your business leaders so they actually understand what that means. I'm really surprised that there's still potentially leaders out there that don't get it. With all the data, the deaths, the hospitalisation, I'm really surprised that they don't get it, but I know they do exist.
True. So next question is related to something which you talked about. You talked about the trust being an important factor now. The whole model, one of the slides you talked about the trust now, which comes in. And the question is right now, how do you tackle the issue of moonlighting during the work from home?
Well, I talked a little bit about that also, that many employees certainly that we're seeing in the US, certainly seeing in Europe, maybe not as much in Asia, a little bit in Australia, but they have a side gig or another role. And I think, if you look at those of the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z that play around with technology, they will do their normal full-time job for you, but they're already playing with something else on the side. I think organisations need to encourage that, because sometimes they've got really interesting things that they're doing that could benefit the organisation. You can't stop them doing something on the side. And many of them then eventually leave and go and start up anything from a Bitcoin to an Afterpay to something like that. So as long as you can see performance for the role that they're doing, you're gonna struggle the issue of them having something on the side. And whether they're working from home or whether they're working in the office, just because you can see them in the office doesn't mean that they're not on their computer doing something else for their own business. So it's about how you're open with that, rather than trying to minimize it. If they're not performing, then you've got a different conversation to have.
True. Very true about it. Anyway, people were, if they wanted to do something, they would still be doing. Now they get some more freedom, but I think that's, some compromise has to be done in that. And we have to allow people to do certain things. For example, in many of the tech companies, they allow contribution to the open source software, that you can actually contribute. And that helps the company in a way.
We're seeing a lot of organisations, and it's not a new concept. And I was lucky enough to do this about 8 years ago. And that was undertake a series of programs with Stanford and Berkeley based around design thinking, and giving employees the opportunity to resolve an issue, to innovate using design thinking, actually builds a skill set for them, and at the same time adds an additional opportunity for the organisation in terms of being open to new ideas. I think and then there still are traditional organisations around where the leaders think that all the best ideas come from the executive team and nowhere else. We're seeing so many smart people now coming up with ways of doing things differently within an organisation, that a smart CEO and executive team has a listening mechanism to this and understands how to talk to their employees effectively to bring that innovation into the business rather than letting it disappear outside of the business. So innovation and design thinking have even more of a role to play in the post-COVID world than they did in the pre-COVID world.
True. And I think it's also different kinds of companies. Companies have to understand the context of it and how they perform. And I think you mentioned it, measuring the whole model. This model is not like September 1st, you start a model and that's the way it is going to work. You have to continuously measure and adapt it. What are you trying to measure? If you're measuring the productivity, for example, then that's it. If it is successful, that's how you go about doing that, and you have to keep on making the tweaks in that. I think that's a very important part, the measuring the model. And this model is, everyone, it's not going to be one size fits all. You have to put something in place, measure it, and then continuously keep on tweaking it. It's a big transformation time now.
Yeah, you've got to be careful here, Partha, that you're not just measuring the tangible numbers, i.e. Revenue, sales, new customers, a net promoter score, etc. You've got to make sure that you're also measuring in the right way the softer elements of, communication, of engagement. We call it the employee experience, but you've also got to be able to measure those. And the thing that HR has to do here is to make sure that they have some data analytics to support the measures, because like most business leaders, if you come and tell me there's a problem and you're guessing it from gut feel, then the likelihood of me doing anything about that's going to be small. If you can actually show me from the data that you've collated about a potential problem and the trending on that, and then share some insights with me as to how we might resolve it, then I will absolutely pay attention to that piece. And that's really important. I still hear of too many stories of HR sharing an issue, but in a lot of cases, there's no facts or there's no data to support it. So, if you're going to be a full stack HR engineer, you've got to get your head around analytics. There's a big difference between data and analytics. Data is what I call a scorecard. It's about what the turnover was last month, what it was last year. It's by male or female. It's all of the past tense scorecard data. What I call analytics is to be able to look at current data and then start to see some trends and forecast those trends. But then the critical part of that is, what are your insights as a business leader to go back to your leader and say, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I think the problem is, and here's what I think we should do about it. Most business leaders will take that with open arms.
Right. So we are almost at the end of it. I'll ask you one generic question there, and mostly around, people are talking about a lot of advantages about remote working, but from your experience, where are the problem areas of remote working? What you see, and I'm sure everything has some advantages and disadvantages there. From your experience, I'm pretty sure everyone has their own experiences. From your experience, what would you say the top one or two things?
Well, I think I mentioned the top one before, and that is just doing too many Zoom meetings in a day. And it's pretty hard. And I find this from time to time, if I'm doing a Zoom meeting now and then about 5 minutes, I've got to race and log on to a WebEx, and then I finish that meeting, and then I've got to go on to a Teams meeting. You spend your whole day doing technology and meetings. It actually doesn't allow you a lot of time to actually step back, look at what needs to be done, look at the strategies, perhaps develop some solutions, etc. So you need to be very vigilant, and you need to let your people know that they don't need to be on Zoom from the moment they get up to the moment they finish. And that's the biggest complaint that we hear, that there are too many Zoom, WebEx, Teams, Google Net, whatever meetings, and it actually doesn't allow me to get my work done. That's probably the biggest issue. I think the other one that we're hearing a lot of is that there's still a place for face-to-face meetings. And I think, people are dying to have a cup of coffee or talk. I've come across a few CEOs who tell me that the only way you're going to get true innovation is by having a face-to-face conversation. I have to say I disagree with that, because you're still having a face-to-face, albeit a screen. But the other big issue that I'm hearing is not enough ability to connect with people. It's easy to be remote. A lot of people live in an apartment by themselves, so unless they've got a dog or a cat, they're not meeting or having any interaction with people, and that's having an impact on confidence. It's having an impact on their own personal well-being. So too much screen time, and probably the other one I'm hearing is a little bit of no connectivity with other people. They're the two big issues.
Sure. And the face-to-face meeting, I think so this is particularly an issue which I face, in a Zoom meeting or a phone call, the agenda is there. Okay, these are the three things which you have to talk about. But how do you do the chit chat? How do you get the rest of the stuff? How do you know about the family, the kids, and everything? And you build up the relationship. In a phone call, in a web call, it's very agenda focused. These are the 3 points which we want to discuss today. So I totally agree with that the face-to-face meetings is something which very much required to get a pulse.
Partha, it gets back to what I mentioned earlier as well. Sorry to cut in on you, but this is the additional skill set that our leaders need to have. So in a Zoom with multiple people, it's pretty hard for me to ask you, so tell me what's happening at home, tell me how your young son's going, or tell me what are you doing to keep your balance right? Are you doing fitness? What are you doing? This is an important part where the leader after one of these meetings has to make time. And if I'm your leader, I've got to come back to you and say, look, I want to have a chat about you. Can we meet up in about an hour's time or tomorrow for half an hour, and I just want to talk about you. Tell me what's working for you. Tell me what's not. How are you doing? What are you doing outside, et cetera, et cetera. So those sorts of skills, and that I use that empathy in leadership, are really important, not just the show me the numbers, show me the productivity, et cetera.
Sure. Makes sense, Alec. So I think it has been a wonderful discussion today, and some interesting questions there. And I'm sure it has given a framework to think about it. I mean, we're not trying to provide answers to all problems. It's a framework to think and show some trends based on what's happening, based on Josh Berssin's academy and their experience on this. So it's very interesting. So thank you. Thanks, Alec, for this extremely informative session. And guys, everyone, thanks for attending this. We will be sharing this presentation, and the video should be up soon on our website of the whole webinar. Thanks once again, all right?
No problem. If someone wants to know something about the Josh Bersin Academy, if they want to ping me, or if you want to provide the email address, I'll be happy to respond.
All right. Take care then.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.